Hundreds of thousands of pro-democracy Ukrainians in the streets today protested against the results of the presidential election, pitting their candidate, the West-leaning challenger Viktor Yushchenko, against the pro-Moscow Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych. They claim Yanukovych's victory was rigged, with reports of ballot stuffing and voter intimidation.
Last night, the country's election commission ignored reports of fraud, declaring Kremlin-backed Viktor Yanukovych the winner. Far from backing down, Yushchenko has called for a nationwide strike, warning the country is on the verge of civil war.
So 2014 was, in a sense, a pivotal year, as Eastern Europe again saw borders altered by violence and the threat of force. As part of Ukraine, Crimea was annexed by Russia, and Putin, announcing that Ukraine as a whole was a failed state, sent his forces into eastern Ukraine. And yet, the tinder for this explosion didn't just spontaneously come into being in 2014. In fact, neither did the larger emergency about the recent difficult post-Soviet politics of transition over the last two to three decades. Rather, the background to this crisis is a slow-motion identity crisis involving both Ukraine and Russia and extending back over centuries.
These are the scenes that triggered the breakup of Ukraine, scenes that have brought the world to the brink of a new Cold War. Unarmed protesters gunned down in the streets by the riot police who were retreating from Kiev's Maidan Square. By the end of the day, more than 50 people were dead, including 3 policemen. Ukraine's new leaders maintain that responsibility for the shootings lies entirely with the security forces acting on behalf of the previous government. Our investigations suggest that is not the full picture. Only 3 people have been arrested over the killings, all of them members of this police unit, seen firing here towards the protesters. That was after 9 o'clock in the morning, as government forces retreated from the square. But what prompted the police to pull back?
This is eastern Ukraine. Conflict broke out here in 2014, and it hasn't ended. There are about 100,000 fighters stationed here, which makes it one of the most heavily militarized areas on Earth. There are Ukrainian forces to the west and Russia-backed separatist militias to the east. Fighting between the two groups occurs here, along the contact line.
Архитекторов, первый дом, 101-я школа. Я только оттуда. Я еще от шока не отошла. Что случилось? Что случилось? Попало? Не знаю, что это попало. Я не специалист в войне, что это попало. Но очень страшно. Громыхало, стекла повылетали. Я не знаю, что. Я не знаю, что.
Были ли здесь бойцы? Какие-то военные были?
Я не видела никого. Ни военных, ни только гражданские люди. Не знаю. Я на эмоциях. У меня руки трусятся. Я в халате размялся. Папа. Вот здесь вот. Господи, ой, Господи, боже мой. Наташа. Да, снимают. Люди дома были.
По вашему видению, по вашим наблюдениям, откуда могли ли с позиции ополченцев лететь снаряды? Или вы не можете это сказать?
Я не знаю. Я абсолютно в этом не ориентируюсь.
Over 10,000 people have died since the conflict in Ukraine began, and about 1.5 million have been displaced, while both sides continue to build up their forces. The conflict began at the end of 2013, when the Ukrainian government rejected an association with the European Union in order to build stronger ties with Russia. The pro-Moscow move led to massive protests in the capital, Kiev, which turned deadly by 2014. Russia took advantage of the chaos and sent its military in to annex Crimea in March. A month later, pro-Russian separatists in the Donbas seized the cities of Luhansk and Donetsk and declared them independent from Ukraine. The Ukrainian army moved to take the region back, but Russia covertly joined the separatist rebels, which led to fierce fighting for several months. In February 2015, both sides settled on a peace agreement called Minsk II. The deal laid down conditions for a ceasefire in the security zone, where heavy artillery, tanks, and mortars were banned. Foreign militaries, meaning Russia, had to leave Ukraine. It also recognized the two separatist areas, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, and outlined how they could be reincorporated back into Ukraine. But despite the agreement, none of that has happened.
This thing with Russia is just like the craziest thing in the world. Like, the idea that we're actually flirting with a nuclear conflict with Russia is the most important priority in the history of humanity, is that America and Russia do not go to war. There's nothing more important than that. That's it. We'll destroy the human species if we do this. And yet there's this war right on Russia's border, and there's no effort to negotiate going on. There's like no effort. In fact, from very solid reporting, that actually America, through Boris Johnson, told Ukraine not to negotiate with Russia at the very beginning of the war, when they had a deal worked out. They had a deal worked out. There's been reported in multiple sources that they had a deal worked out, and the deal was basically that Vladimir Putin would pull back. He would pull back his troops and leave Ukraine under the condition that the very simple conditions that Ukraine guaranteed autonomy for the Donbas region and agreed to never join NATO. And like, that was a deal. Like, okay, I'm not saying everyone thinks that's the perfect deal, but it's better than what we got right now.
Better than nuclear war.
And right now, just the other day, dude, the official narrative on this whole war, it's just like it makes no sense. And again, like I said, remember, the same people who are pushing this are the ones who are telling you Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and stuff. But the official narrative, Joe, is basically that, Vladimir Putin is a madman, a crazy war criminal who's hell-bent on reforming the Soviet Union, and this is a real threat that he could do this. But also he's getting humiliated in this war in Ukraine. So like he's losing the poorest country in Europe, and he's just getting humiliated and beat back. But he's still a real threat to take over all of Europe. And he's a complete madman, by the way, Joe. Soros-funded NGOs were funding the militias on the ground who were overthrowing the government. And then there's a tape of Victoria Nuland, who was at the State Department at the time, one of the top people at the State Department, and she was basically talking about who would be the new government that took over, who America didn't want in, who we did want in the new government. So it's not, what happened basically was, as Gideon Rose was even saying, the Ukrainian government was kind of siding with Russia, or at least a lot more pro-Russia, and then we overthrew that government and installed a pro-America government. And this, to Putin, he had said over and over again, was a huge red line for him. Like, Ukraine was the big line. And you could imagine, take it from our point of view, if like Russia was coming over here and overthrowing the pro-America government in Montreal and installing a pro-Russia government there. Then, you know, like this would be seen as, would you call that an unprovoked attack?
Right.
Weird, no one, like, at least in the larger conversation, I don't see anyone connecting these things, is that there's two things like involving Ukraine that were very big, that happened very recently in American history, that very much connect to this war. And one is that our last president was impeached over a thing with Ukraine. And like, what was that? And then the other thing is the current president's son was getting paid millions of dollars from a company, Burisma, in Ukraine. And these things all connect. And basically what happened was, after the 2014 coup, this company, Burisma, they were, and by the way, Matt Taibbi has done incredible reporting on this. I highly recommend everyone read his stuff, his Substacks. Incredible.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
Unbelievable. But so basically, Burisma was in bed with the old government that had allied with Russia. And so when this government was overthrown, they were very worried, because they were like, oh, we were in bed with the old government, and now there's this new government who's in there. And so instead of bribing the new government, they just went right to the source and bribed the son of the sitting vice president. Joe Biden, when he was vice president, was in charge of Ukraine policy. So they just went, that was why they put him there. And then they put some other like CIA guy or something like that on their board. They're just paying him money to just be like, hey, keep us in with you. And then Trump was telling them to investigate all of this shit. He got on the phone with them and was like, I want to investigate everything that was going on with Joe and Hunter Biden in Ukraine. And Donald Trump did. He got into an area that there's an argument it was not okay what he was doing, because he was kind of going like, maybe you don't get these weapons that I was going to send in unless you go investigate them. And this was his political opponent, so it was a little bit of a shady thing. But then the other story about that is that ultimately Trump caved, and he sent in the weapons to Ukraine. So now, not only did Obama overthrow the regime when Joe Biden was the point man, Joe Biden was running Ukraine policy, Obama leads this coup, overthrows that government and puts in a pro-Western government. Then Trump comes in, sends in a whole bunch of weapons to this new government that Obama wouldn't even send in because he was concerned it would provoke Russia. And then the next president is Joe Biden, the last guy who was the point man on Ukraine, who was there when this coup happened. Then he comes back in. And this is all like the context that led to Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine.
We are now several months into the conflict with Russia. I say we, because we are all pretending here in the West that the real war is between Russia and Ukraine, but nod, nod, wink, wink. If we clandestinely, in some sense, provide full support to Ukraine, maybe the Russians, foolish and backward as they are, won't notice, and we can simultaneously pretend that we aren't flirting with the prospect of a long, arduous, and inconceivably destructive war. Dr. Kagan essentially put forward the thesis that Vladimir Putin is a prototypical authoritarian, and that Russia's foray into Ukraine might be properly viewed as an expression of the imperial expansionism that characterized the Soviet Union. So this is Cold War round 2.
For the order. Here in eastern Ukraine, spring is in the air, and so is heavy artillery. They are firing 152mm howitzers. They're the biggest guns in the Ukrainian arsenal until Western-supplied 155s join the battle. That shell weighs 53 kilos, just shy of 8.5 stone, and this gun can propel it over 10 miles. Incredibly, back at headquarters, they watch live pictures of the target area. A Ukrainian drone supplies real-time images of the shells finding their mark. And if they're slightly off target, the necessary adjustments can be passed on to the gun crews, and instantly. Their salvo complete, they ordered us to hurry into a bunker. So they've rushed all of us into one of the dugouts here because of the danger of incoming Russian artillery. Outgoing fire attracts incoming. While Russian artillery did not reply, we knew Russian warplanes were about. This is an airstrike, and this is a Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile on the hunt. Eventually, we saw a jet putting out flares and flying low in the hope that Ukrainian missiles would not lock on.
The war in Ukraine is pushing global food prices sharply higher. Russia and Ukraine produce nearly a third of the world's wheat, and the conflict is disrupting supplies.
The crisis in Ukraine was already causing a rise in global oil prices. But the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, one of the world's top oil producers, has pushed oil prices beyond $100 a barrel for the first time since 2014. This means many households across the continent will face increased energy and transportation costs, and the price of imported goods will go up.
Grain imports from Ukraine and Russia. Sal, current chairperson of the African Union, says Putin is willing to help. There is a catch. Russia says it will let grain shipments leave Ukraine only if sanctions are lifted. Meanwhile, Ukraine alleges Russia is stealing grain to supply its allies.